A scream rips through the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle on a freezing winter night in 1457 AD. It echoes against the walls, sharper than the howling winds outside, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. In a dimly lit chamber, the glow of trembling candles casts long, monstrous shadows. And on a bed soaked with sweat and blood, a child lies trapped in agony. She is Lady Margaret Beaufort, just 13 years old, a girl who should be learning to dance, to pray, to write letters of innocence. Yet here she writhes, her small frame straining against a burden far too great. Her fingers clutch the sheets, nails digging deep into the fabric as waves of pain convulse through her. Her hair, once neatly braided, clings in wet strands to her pale face. Around her, midwives whisper frantic prayers in Latin. They know the danger. They know her hips are too narrow, her body too young, still unfinished in its growth. Each cry from Margaret feels like the last breath she will ever take. Outside, snow falls silently over Bedfordshire, covering the earth in a white shroud. Inside, life and death wrestle within the same room. The baby will not come easily. The midwives glance at each other, their faces grave in the candlelight. They fear both mother and child may not survive the night. But history waits for neither mercy nor fairness. That baby, tearing through Margaret's frail body, will become the future King Henry VII, the man who ends the Wars of the Roses, establishes the Tudor dynasty, and fathers the infamous Henry VIII. A dynasty that will forever reshape England, born from the screams of a girl still trapped between childhood and womanhood. The irony is brutal. The fate of an entire nation rests upon a child who may not survive her own labor. The dynasty that will crown queens and kings, wage wars, and decide the future of Europe begins here, in this cold chamber, with a 13-year-old girl bleeding into the sheets. This is not the story of golden crowns or triumph. This is the story of suffering, of a child bride forced into motherhood, of how one girl's pain birthed a dynasty, while her body and her innocence were shattered forever. And to understand the Tudors, you must first understand the tragedy of Margaret Beaufort. Long before the night of screams and blood, before Margaret Beaufort's fragile body was torn apart to bring forth a dynasty, her fate had already been written in ink and sealed in ambition. She was born on May 31st, 1443, in Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire, a time when England was not a land of peace, but a kingdom split by rival claims, distrust, and the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. The War of the Roses had not yet erupted, but its seeds were already in the soil. The realm was restless, nobles were divided, and the throne of England wobbled like a crown balanced on glass. Margaret's birth was not the joyous arrival of a beloved daughter. It was a calculation. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a descendant of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, giving Margaret a faint but real bloodline claim to the throne. But fortune never favoured the Beauforts for long. John Beaufort fell into disgrace, accused of military failure in France, and he died, by illness, or perhaps by his own hand, when Margaret was barely a year old. His death left her not just fatherless, but also heiress to the vast Beaufort estates. And with inheritance came danger. Margaret was rich, Margaret was noble, Margaret was useful. In a world where girls were pawns and marriages were weapons, her future was no longer her own. From the moment she could walk, the church wrapped itself around her existence. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, sought to shield her only daughter, but she knew well that protection was limited. Girls of wealth and lineage were not meant to choose. They were meant to be chosen. Every smile, every prayer, every scrap of education Margaret received was not for her own sake, but for the men who would one day control her. By 7 years old, while other children still played with dolls or tripped through gardens, Margaret was being groomed for destiny. Tutors recited scripture, not fairy tales. She learned obedience, silence, piety. She was told that suffering was a woman's burden, and that submission was God's design. The words pressed into her heart like iron shackles. preparing her for, a life where her body would serve dynasties greater than herself. She was a child, yes, but to the powerful, she was already a bride in waiting. As the child Margaret grew, England's crown grew heavier with uncertainty. King Henry VI, a monarch, plagued by weakness and bouts of madness, held the throne with trembling hands. Around him, rival nobles circled like wolves, each claiming a stronger right, each hungering for the crown's legitimacy. In this storm, Margaret's bloodline mattered more than her age, more than her humanity. By the time she was 9 years old, her guardianship, and with it, her marriage prospects, had been sold and traded among England's most ambitious men. She was less a child of flesh and more a living title deed, a package of lands and claims wrapped in a girl's small frame. To own Margaret's future was to hold power. The church often cloaked such dealings in divine justification. Margaret was taught to bow her head and accept what was God's will. But God's will looked remarkably like men's ambition. Noblemen whispered her name in councils, debating who might seize her hand for advantage. Her body had not yet matured, yet already it was currency. At 12 years old, the decision was made. Margaret Beaufort, still no more than a child clutching a rosary, was betrothed to Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was a man in his mid-20s, battle-hardened, politically savvy, and very aware of the fortune and legitimacy tied to this frail girl. For him, the marriage was a ladder. For Margaret, it was a prison door clanging shut. She was taken into his household, away from her mother, away from the fragile innocence she had left. The journey to Wales, where she would live under Edmund's authority, must have felt like an exile. Each mile carried her further from childhood and deeper into the machinery of dynastic ambition. Imagine a girl of 12, sitting in a drafty hall, as men toasted her union, their laughter echoing while she sat silent, terrified, and voiceless. The ink of contracts had already decided her womb's purpose. Her body was to be the vessel through which a dynasty would rise. Whether she was ready, or whether she survived, was not the question. Margaret prayed more fervently than ever. In cold chapels, with stone biting her knees, she begged for protection, for mercy, for strength. But prayers could not shield her from what awaited. Wales was a land of rugged hills and ancient castles, a place where the Tudor family sought to carve its power into the stone of English politics. For Margaret, though, it was a world far from the comforts of Bedfordshire. The journey to her husband's household had been long and cold, and when she arrived, she found not warmth, but expectation. Edmund Tudor was no gentle guardian. Though he carried royal blood as the half-brother of King Henry VI, he was a man of calculation. He saw in Margaret the key to a legacy, her inheritance, her claim, her potential to bear him a son who could stake a firmer place for the Tudors in England's dangerous Game of Thrones. She, barely 12, was not a partner to him. She was a vessel. The union was not delayed. Even though her body had not yet finished growing, Edmund wasted no time in pressing his rights as a husband. The church's blessing made the marriage lawful. Morality and compassion played no role. To be wed at 12 and pregnant by 13 was a sentence, not a choice. The household around Margaret treated it as destiny fulfilled. Servants whispered, priests prayed, and courtiers spoke of the fortune this young bride carried. But for Margaret, the reality was one of confusion, fear, and isolation. She had been a child one day and a wife the next, and within months, she was with child. Her pregnancy was no quiet, gentle affair. Her body, still small and narrow, strained beneath the weight of a growing life. Each step was labor, each night's rest broken by discomfort. Midwives shook their heads in worry. They knew the dangers of a girl so young attempting to bear a child. But concern did not stop the relentless march of time. Her womb became the battlefield where survival would be decided. By the winter of 1456, Margaret's condition was the talk of her household. She was barely 13, her stomach swollen, her frame fragile, and her face pale. While others toasted the coming heir, she lived in constant pain and fear. Every day she prayed that she might live long enough to see the child's face, even as whispers in the corridors wondered whether either mother or infant would survive the ordeal. What made her suffering crueler still was the indifference of the world beyond her chamber walls. England itself was sliding toward chaos. The fragile peace around King Henry VI was shattering. The rival claims of York and Lancaster were hardening into war. And in the middle of it all, this girl, this child, was being broken in silence, her pain hidden beneath the weight of dynastic necessity. History would remember the Tudor dynasty as strong, ruthless, and enduring. But its foundation was being built here, on the frail spine of a 13-year-old girl forced into womanhood before she could even understand what it meant. By early 1457, the inevitable could no longer be delayed. Margaret, scarcely more than a child herself, was swollen with life. Her frame was slight, her hips narrow, her body unfinished. Midwives looked upon her with dread. They had seen too many girls die in childbed. Some whispered that both mother and child would not survive. The castle grew tense as her time drew near. Fires crackled in the great hall, servants hurried about, with hushed voices, and priests offered masses for a safe delivery. Yet in the cold corridors of Bletsoe Castle, death hung like frost in the air. The pain began suddenly, tearing through her frail body like a storm breaking the sky. She was carried to her chamber, laid upon a bed with linen sheets soon stained in crimson. Hours passed. Her screams echoed through the stone halls, a haunting sound that chilled even the most hardened knight. The midwives, seasoned women, accustomed to birth and death alike, grew pale as they worked. Candles burned low, shadows danced against the hot walls, and the room became a battlefield where a girl fought for her life. Margaret's body convulsed with the strain. Each contraction was a wave of agony she was far too young to endure. Her small frame twisted, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with terror. She clung to the blood-soaked sheets, as if gripping life itself. At times, she seemed to drift into unconsciousness, her pulse faltering, and still the labor dragged on. The baby was too large for her, the midwives whispered, and her body too narrow. Death hovered in the chamber, waiting, but destiny, cruel and unrelenting, forced its course. At last, after hours of torment that stretched like centuries, a wail pierced the chamber. A newborn's cry, fragile yet defiant. It was a boy, Henry Tudor, the child who would grow to be Henry VII, who would one day claim the English throne, end the Wars of the Roses, and found a dynasty that changed history forever. But the victory came at a brutal cost. Margaret lay pale, broken, her body torn by the ordeal. She was only 13, her girlhood stolen, her innocence buried beneath blood and screams. Though she survived, she would never bear another child. Again, her womb scarred by the cruelty of a fate she never chose. History remembers the Tudors for their power, their crowns, their ruthless glory. But before there was triumph, there was suffering. Before the dynasty, there was a girl child nearly crushed beneath its weight. And so, the Tudor legacy was not born in triumph, but in torment. The birth of Henry Tudor had nearly killed Margaret. Though she survived, her body bore scars that would never heal. She was a mother, yet still a child herself, frail, pale, and weakened. But there was no time for recovery, no gentle easing into life's new role. Fate was merciless. In November of 1456, Edmund Tudor had been captured by Yorkist forces as the kingdom's civil strife deepened into open war. He was imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle, where disease spread as swiftly as rumour. By December, he was dead. Some said of plague, others whispered of poison or neglect. Whatever the truth, Margaret was left a widow before her 14th birthday, cradling an infant son in a world filled with enemies. The death of her husband should have offered her some freedom, but it did not. Instead, it left her vulnerable. As a girl with land, bloodline, and a newborn heir, she was once again a prize to be claimed. Nobles circled her like hawks, eager to control the boy who might one day carry royal authority. Margaret's life narrowed into two purposes: survival and the protection of her son. Her fragile body had been broken, but her spirit hardened. In the stillness of winter chapels, she prayed not only for strength, but for the wisdom to navigate a kingdom tearing itself apart. England was sliding into chaos. The Lancastrians, loyal to Henry VI, battled the Yorkists under Richard, Duke of York. The land split red and white as the Wars of the Roses began. Families were divided, loyalties shattered, and fields became graves. For Margaret, this was not just politics. It was the battlefield upon which her son's fate would be decided. At barely 13, she was both mother and widow, and in her arms she held a child destined to be hunted and fought over. The bloodshed of England's nobility had found its way into her very womb, and she knew that if she faltered, her son would not live to see manhood. Widowed at 13, Margaret should have been allowed the comfort of home, time to heal, and the gentle embrace of her mother. But England was not kind to women, least of all to those whose blood carried claims to crowns. She was not permitted grief, nor solitude. Instead, she was swiftly remarried, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, a man twice her age and loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Her new marriage offered stability in name, but it was no freedom. Margaret had no choice. She was passed from one man to another like a relic of value, her body a token of alliance, her child the currency of power. In her heart, though, she clung to one truth. Henry Tudor was all she had left of herself. Her boy, born of agony, was her anchor. She would endure anything to see him live. But survival was never certain. The Wars of the Roses had erupted in full. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York tore England apart in brutal battles that littered the fields with corpses and crowned them with widows. Nobles rose and fell in dizzying succession. Towns burned, families starved, and the kingdom staggered beneath the weight of endless bloodshed. Amid this chaos, Margaret's son was both precious and perilous. To the Lancastrians, he was a living heir to legitimacy. To the Yorkists, he was a threat. The boy barely knew the warmth of childhood before he became the subject of whispers, strategies, and plots. Margaret, still no more than 14, carried the weight of a dynasty on her thin shoulders. Every night she prayed over the crib of her child, knowing enemies would one day come for him. She was not a warrior, not a queen, but she was a mother, and that role gave her a steel that no sword could shatter. Her body had been broken by childbirth, her innocence stolen by forced marriages, but her resolve only deepened. In a world where women were pawns, Margaret vowed she would become a player. The tide of war would rise higher, blood would run thicker, and as Margaret watched the kingdom burn around her, she began to see the path. If her son was to survive, if he was to one day wear the crown that others killed for, then she would need to outthink and outlast every man who believed her a mere girl. As the Wars of the Roses raged on, the kingdom became a chessboard drenched in blood. Lancastrian and Yorkist banners clashed in fields that turned to graveyards, each battle shifting the crown from one head to another. Margaret watched it all with the cold clarity of survival. Every victory and defeat rippled through her life. For her son was tied to Lancaster's fortunes, and Lancaster was losing. The turning point came at Towton in 1461. It was one of the bloodiest battles England had ever seen, fought in snow and slaughter. The Yorkists triumphed, and Edward IV took the throne. For Margaret, the red rose was crushed beneath white petals, drenched in blood. Her boy, barely 4 years old, was now a hunted heir. The new king would never allow a Tudor child with Lancastrian blood to grow unchallenged. Henry Tudor was too dangerous to remain in England. Plans were made, and he was spirited away across the sea to Brittany. There, in a foreign land, the child grew under watchful protection, exiled, yet alive. Margaret, still a teenager herself, was left behind, her arms empty, her prayers desperate. To lose him would be to lose the last piece of her soul. She could not raise him, could not guide him, could not even see him. All she could do was maneuver in England's deadly court, weaving alliances, smiling at men who underestimated her, and waiting. The years hardened her. Where once she had been a frightened girl, now she became a strategist cloaked in piety. The rosary beads in her hands hid a mind sharpening into steel. Each Lancastrian defeat, each Yorkist triumph only deepened her determination. If God had chosen her son to survive that night of agony when he was born, then surely he had chosen him for more. Margaret believed it with a fervour that bordered on obsession. Henry Tudor was destined to be king. The world saw only a small, pious woman, draped in modest gowns, lips murmuring prayers. They did not see the storm behind her eyes, the iron will forged in childbirth, widowhood, and exile. She had suffered beyond measure, but she endured, and she would endure until her son returned. As the Wars of the Roses dragged on into decades, England bled, and kings rose and fell. Yet through it all, Margaret Beaufort waited, plotted, and survived. She knew the day would come when her boy, Henry, would return from exile. And when that day came, she would move heaven and earth to see him crowned. The Tudor destiny, born in torment, had only just begun. By the 1480s, Margaret Beaufort was no longer the frightened girl who had screamed through childbirth at 13. She was a woman of steel resolve, cloaked in piety, but driven by a single, consuming purpose to see her son crowned King of England. The kingdom was fractured. Edward IV had reigned, died, and left behind a storm. His sons, young Edward V and his brother Richard, vanished into the Tower of London, whispered to have been murdered by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Now Richard III wore the crown, a king haunted by blood and suspicion. His reign was fragile, his enemies many. To Margaret, this chaos was divine providence. She saw God's hand clearing the path for Henry Tudor. After years in exile in Brittany, Henry was the last surviving hope for the Lancastrians, and through his mother's tireless plotting, he was positioned as the only true alternative to Richard's troubled rule. But to challenge a king was to invite death. Every alliance Margaret wove was a rope that could strangle her if pulled too tight. Yet she did not falter. She risked everything, her lands, her life, her very soul, for the chance to put her son upon the throne. In secret chambers, amidst candlelight and whispered oaths, Margaret conspired with those who despised Richard III. She reached out even to the discontented Yorkists, binding them with promises of unity through her son. The great gamble was sealed when she proposed a marriage. Henry Tudor would wed Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. A union of red rose and white, a promise to end the decades of war. It was genius, or madness. A boy long exiled, with only a claim through his mother, would return to a land bathed in civil war and attempt to take the crown from a sitting king. But Margaret had endured too much to doubt. To her, this was destiny, the fulfillment of all her suffering. And so, in the summer of 1485, the gamble was cast. Henry Tudor, hardened by exile, sailed from Brittany with a small army, while Margaret waited in England, her every breath tied to his survival. The kingdom itself held its breath, for the final act of the Wars of the Roses was about to be written in blood. August 22nd, 1485. A field in Leicestershire became the crucible where England's future would be forged. The morning mist clung to the grass, muffling the movements of thousands of soldiers as banners of red and white unfurled in the grey light. On one side stood King Richard III, armoured and defiant, commanding the might of a king, though his crown sat uneasy on his head. On the other marched Henry Tudor, returned from exile, carrying not just swords, but the desperate hope of an exhausted realm. His force was small, outnumbered, its men weary from the march. By all logic, he should not have stood a chance. But Logic had never ruled Margaret Beaufort's life. It was faith, suffering, and iron will. And here, on this field, her son's fate, and hers, would be decided. The battle began in thunder. Arrows darkened the sky, men screamed, steel rang against steel. Horses reared, their flanks streaked with blood, as lines clashed in brutal chaos. Richard fought with the fury of a man who knew he could not afford to lose. He cut through soldiers with raw desperation, his crown within reach of death's hand. Henry, less a warrior than a claimant, relied on the loyalty of his commanders. His banner swayed dangerously as Yorkist forces pressed forward. For a moment, it seemed Margaret's dream would die here in the mud, crushed beneath Richard's charge. And then came betrayal. The Stanleys, powerful lords who had long wavered between York and Lancaster, chose their moment. With their armies poised on the edges of the fight, they surged at last, not against Henry, but against Richard. The tide turned in an instant. Richard, refusing to flee, hurled himself into the fray. He fought his way toward Henry himself, determined to end the rebellion with his own blade. Chronicles say he came within arm's reach of the boy claimant. But surrounded, outnumbered, dragged from his horse, Richard fell beneath the crush of soldiers. His crown was torn from his head, his body pierced and broken, left in the dirt. And there, upon Bosworth's field, Henry Tudor was hailed king. The red rose had triumphed, joined at last with the white. The wars of the roses ended not with peace, but with death. And from the ruin, a new dynasty was born. News of Bosworth travelled like wildfire across England, carried on the lips of messengers and the whispers of peasants. For most, it was the shocking death of a king. For Margaret Beaufort, it was the birth of destiny. When the word reached her, Henry had survived. Henry had triumphed. Henry was king. She fell to her knees in prayer. All her suffering, the child, ripped from her body at 13, the years of loneliness, the humiliations, the danger of treason charges, the ceaseless gamble of alliance and betrayal. It had all led to this moment. Her son, once a fragile baby barely wrestled into the world, now wore the crown of England. But Margaret knew better than to bask in victory. She had lived too long in the shadows of kings to believe the throne brought peace. With Henry's coronation, in October 1485, the Tudor dynasty began. But enemies lurked at every turn. Pretenders would rise, rebellions would burn, and the ghosts of the Wars of the Roses would not easily rest. Still, for the first time, Margaret was not a pawn. She was the king's mother. My lady the king's mother, as she styled herself with deliberate majesty. No Englishwoman before her had claimed such a title. She stood at the very heart of power, wielding influence not as a queen, but as the architect of a dynasty. And yet, behind every triumph lay the shadow of sacrifice. She had given her body, her youth, her freedom for this crown. Her son's reign would be remembered as the foundation of the Tudors, but her own scars told the hidden story, that England's new dawn had been purchased with the agony of a girl too young to be a mother, and too strong ever to surrender. As the bells of Westminster rang, and Henry VII processed through cheering crowds, Margaret watched not as a passive spectator, but as the quiet force who had made it all possible. From pawn to kingmaker, her life's gamble had paid off. But the question that lingered, unspoken, was this. Had England truly been saved by her sacrifice, or merely bound to a new chain of blood and ambition? Margaret Beaufort lived long enough to see her son firmly on the throne, his reign consolidating power, his marriage to Elizabeth of York, binding the red rose and the white in fragile unity. She became a presence in the Tudor court unlike any woman before her, neither queen nor consort, but the king's mother. Her seal bore the crowned arms of England beside her own. Her voice carried weight in matters of state, marriage, and church. In her later years, she poured her energy into acts of devotion and legacy. She endowed colleges at Cambridge, ensuring that the faith which had sustained her through decades of trial would shape generations to come. She surrounded herself with prayer, charity, and learning, yet always with the shrewd watchfulness of a woman who had clawed her way to survival in a brutal age, but the scars of her early life never left her. She remained fiercely protective of her only son, sometimes to the point of smothering control. Courtiers whispered that even as king, Henry deferred to her will, bowing to the mother who had gambled everything to see him crowned. Perhaps he understood, as only he could, that he was not merely her son, but her life's mission, her proof that suffering had not been in vain. When she died in 1509, just 2 months after Henry VII, her grandson Henry VIII ascended the throne. The boy, born in agony at 13, became the founder of a dynasty that would change England forever. His children, Henry VIII's daughters Mary the Firm and Elizabeth VIII, would redefine monarchy, religion, and empire. The Tudors would burn her name into the very fabric of history. And yet, beneath that glittering legacy lies the truth of a girl in a dark chamber, her body breaking to bring forth a crown. The dynasty's golden sheen was forged in blood, pain, and the iron will of a mother who refused to surrender. Margaret Beaufort's story forces us to ask, was her triumph a victory for faith, resilience, and destiny, or a haunting reminder of how power devours the innocent to feed the throne? The Tudors rose from her suffering. England was forever changed. But at what cost?